Okay guys, it's time to take your middle game strategy to the next level, and the coolest thing about it is that you're actually going to experience it. You're going to see it by the end of this lesson. You're going to feel like you know more middle game strategy than you knew before. So you're going to have an opportunity to test a lot of what you have learned up to this point in the course, but you're also going to learn the next component to get to the next level. And guys, before you know it, if we continue to do things right, you're going to get to a point where you're going to know what to do at every point in your middle game, regardless of the opening that you played, regardless of the position that you got. So let's get started. The first thing that I need from you is to take a look at this position. Position number 1, I only need you guys to tell me if you'd rather be the white pieces in this position or the black pieces. Remember, you can actually tell me by writing it in the comments. That's the way for me to know where you guys are at. So if you don't want to write it in the comments, just think about it and keep track of it. Position number 2, I need to know, guys, if you were the white pieces, would you take on e4 with your bishop, with your rook, or with your knight? And position number 3, I need to know if after the white pieces took here on f5, if you, playing with the black pieces, if you take on f5 with your pawn, with your bishop, or with your rook. Now, just so that you know, in this position number 2, the answer is taking with the bishop. And we're going to talk about it, guys, later in the lesson. I'm going to show you how the game continued, and I'm going to tell you why taking with the bishop makes sense. So now that we went over those positions, let's get to the actual lesson. Now, it is important that you guys understand I'm putting this lesson at this point in the course because we have been talking a lot about the King's Indian defense, the picks, and what you're going to learn in this lesson is going to be very useful in openings like this, but it is also going to be useful in a lot of other openings. Like this position that you have in front of you is from the game that we're going to analyze from beginning to end. And this is actually from a Ruy Lopez or a Spanish game. Nothing to do with the King's Indian defense, but still you're going to see how these ideas are going to be extremely important in the King's Indian defense. So what I'm trying to say is that regardless of the openings that you play, if you guys understand the middle game patterns, you're going to know what to do at all times. So let's get to it. And the first question that I have for you guys is the following. If in this case, the white pieces played pawn takes, and then the black pieces took with the pawn, do you know what to do? Do you know the typical plans in this scenario when we have a center with a pawn on e4 and a pawn on e5? Do you know what to do if instead the black pieces had taken with the knight, and then we have a pawn on e4 and a pawn on d6? Do you know what to do if instead the white pieces had just pushed the pawn and we just go back? Do you know what to do? Do you know the strategic plan for the middle game according to this pawn structure? Well guys, if you answer no to all of these questions, then we have one problem, because at this point in the course, you should know how to deal with this pawn structure. And again, I'm going to show you this game from beginning to end, but up to this point in the game, and I think this is move like number 9 or number 10, you guys should know already what to do. If you know it, excellent. If you don't, let's go over it quickly. Guys, the first thing that should come to mind is this concept that we have talked about many times. When you have the center like this, your target pawn is going to be the pawn in front of your most forward pawn. So if I'm the black pieces, my most forward pawn is e5, I'm going to target this pawn. How do I target it? Well, I'm going to do pawn to f5, and that's how I'm going to put pressure on their pawn chain. If I'm the white pieces, the most forward pawn is the d5 pawn, so they're going to target the d6 pawn that is in front of that pawn. So how are they going to do it? They're going to do c4 and c5. But also, we have this other concept that we have talked about where the pawn chain, the pawn structure, is going to indicate where we should expand, where we should attack. So this is telling us you have more space on the king side, you should be expanding on the king side. For the white pieces, the pawn structure is indicating that they should expand on the queen side. They have more space, that's where they should be putting pressure on. So up to this point, that's what you guys should do. Now, what we're going to be learning in the second part of this lesson is what do we do after we actually did f5. And basically what happens after f5 is the following. Let's say they do something like knight b to d2 and we actually do f5. many people are going to actually take on f5, and what that creates is an outpost for one of the knights, and that's actually a very strong knight that they're going to have on e4. It's a knight that we cannot remove with a pawn, and it's a knight that is going to make the game for their opponent extremely difficult. Now in this case, the black pieces are going to be getting an open or semi-open f-file. So by the time that we castle, our rook is going to be putting pressure on this file. So it's going to come down to what's better, the knight on the outpost or the rook on the f-file. But guys, regardless of what's better, the point of this lesson is for you to know what to do if you have the outpost. We're going to talk about it from white's perspective, and what to do if you have the open or semi-open f-file. So stay tuned, because this lesson is going to be, again, extremely important if you want to take your understanding of the middle game to the next level. So guys, let's get to it. I'm going to put everything back. It is extremely important that you know that even though that I'm focusing on this, because we have been talking about the kings in the defense and the picks, any opening that starts with e4 and e5 is likely to get these patterns where we have the outpost versus the open or semi-open f-file. If any of these pawns gets challenged, let's say that down the road someone does something like f5, they're going to take, and that's when this square becomes available for a knight to come over, and when the black pieces castle, they're going to have that file for the rook. Of course, it's not so easy, but that's the reason why we get it a lot in openings like this. So in this game, Emmanuel Lasker is playing with the white pieces. He goes e4. His opponent Janowski plays e5, and a few moves later, guys, we get into the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. Those of you who are not familiar with it, feel free to go back to lesson, I want to say number 32, where we went over the Ruy Lopez. For those of you who are not familiar with Lasker, guys, Lasker was the second world champion, and he was later defeated by Capablanca. We have talked about Capablanca a lot, but in this game, you're going to see how Lasker with the white pieces gets defeated by Janowski, because Janowski understood this concept that we're just going to go over. Anyways, after bishop b5, a6, we have talked about this before. The black pieces are going after the Spanish bishop, and they don't really mind it if the knight gets taken, because even though the pawn is now hanging, taking it is not a good idea for whites. We could easily just go queen d4, creating a fork, and we're going to get the pawn back. So instead, the white pieces here just went bishop a4. This is one of the most popular continuations for the white pieces. Then knight f6, castle. Notice how the white pieces do not even mind if we take on e4, because if we took, then rook e1, putting a lot of pressure down the e file. Guys, this is one of the main ideas behind castling. We do it to put the king in safety, but also to bring the rook into the game. So if you're playing with the white pieces and your opponent takes on e4, you're going to continue with rook e1, putting pressure on the knight, and the moment the knight moves, then you could eliminate this knight, followed by knight e5. Like, let me give you an example. Let's say they do knight c5, you could take, followed by knight e5, and now you're even threatening to do a discovered check. So it's extremely uncomfortable for the black pieces, and that's why you're not gonna see a lot of people actually taking on e4. So again, the moment they castled, the black pieces just went bishop e7, rook e1, then pawn to d6, c3, trying to break on d4, and then after bishop g4, guys, they went pawn to d4, and we're getting closer to the position that we had before. So here, of course, they're putting pressure on e5, but they're also threatening to do pawn to d5. The knight is pinned, so we have to be careful with a move like pawn to d5. So here, the black pieces did knight to d7, getting away from that pin, and after pawn to d5, the knight went to b8. Again, guys, at this point, you should know exactly what to do. The middle game strategy is to break on f5, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. For the white pieces, it is to put pressure on d6. Now, I'm going to leave it here for a moment, guys, and let me show you this position that I had shown you before. Okay, guys, in this game, Emmanuel Lasker was playing as a white pieces, and he was playing against the first world champion. Pardon my pronunciation, but I think you pronounce his last name Steinitz, and you're going to see how Lasker definitely understood this concept. I told you before that the move is going to be bishop takes e4. Now, how come that we want to put a bishop on e4 if I just told you that this e4 outpost is ideal for one of our knights? Well, there are two ideas behind it. Number one, we want our knight to stay on that outpost, guys. So I don't want to put the knight on e4 right now if I know that they could easily attack it and I'm going to run out of knights to place on that outpost. So that's why they want to put the bishop first, and then when they capture the bishop or when I trade it, then I'm going to have one less piece to challenge my knight. Like if I happen to trade this bishop for this knight or for the bishop on c8, then that's going to be one less piece to challenge whatever knight that I put on e4. And then the other thing is the following. Sometimes the threat is going to be stronger than the actual execution. So the black pieces know that I want to put a knight there, but I don't want to put it right now. They know that a knight is going there, so I'm trying to get in their head. So that's why Lasker just did bishop takes e4. Then the black pieces continued with knight f6, and now another very interesting move by Lasker. And guys, this is a very simple concept, but it is important that you start getting exposure to it. The next move that Lasker did was queen e3. Now, why is this move so important? Well, we should know that if we're ever missing one of our bishops, the queen has to replace that bishop. So I don't have a dark square bishop, and I'm thinking, if I had it, what would be the best square for that bishop? Well, it would be e3. From here, we have a very good scope. We're controlling these diagonals. So since I don't have it, I'm going to use the queen to control those dark squares. So queen e3 happened, and then we have knight takes e4. So that's one less piece that is going to challenge my knight. So now the knight comes to e4, and now the black pieces played rook f4. Guys, this is a very important moment because you need to know this. If you're playing against that outpost, you need to eliminate those knights. So instead of doing rook f4, it is a better idea to do bishop f5 and get rid of that knight. It is true that they're going to do something like knight e2 and replace it, but then we have another knight to remove it. So when we talked about this concept of the outpost, I want to say lesson 52, we learned that we have to identify it, but we also have to secure it. That's not the case for the white pieces. There are still pieces that could put pressure on that outpost. So the black pieces did rook f4 instead of putting pressure on the knight with bishop f5 or something else, and then immediately the white pieces continued with the plan. Remember that also in lesson number 52, we learned how having the knight on the outpost is not enough to win the game. We have to use it. So we have to look at the squares that knight is attacking. So in this case, it's attacking c5. And remember that we wanted to target the pawn in front of our most forward pawn. So the knight is putting pressure on it, but it's also going to help us do pawn to c5. And little by little, we're going to undermine that pawn chain. So pawn to c5 happened. Now bishop f5, a little bit too late. And now a very nice move by Lasker. Knight f to g5. And now with all of the white pieces active, as you can see, we have the knights, the queen, the rooks on the best files they could be on. With all of these pieces active, tactics are going to be in the air. Notice how the knight is ready to go to f7 with a very powerful fork. So for that reason, the black pieces just went queen to d7, keeping an eye out on that square. But I want you to pause the video and tell me what would you have done if they had instead taken on e4. Pause the video and see if you can find a very nice continuation here for the white pieces to win material. Well, the best move here, guys, if you paused the video and you found it, congrats. The move that we're looking for is a move that allows us to execute this. So who is defending f7 now? The rook? Well, we eliminate the rook because we know that we're going to be getting the queen right back for the price of a knight. So we eliminate the rook, check, and then we take on d8. If they take, we could get the bishop afterwards. Let me put this back, guys. In the actual game, they did not do bishop takes e4. They did queen to d7. And please feel free to pause the video again and see if you can find again a way for the white pieces to win material. Well, guys, this one should be a little bit harder to calculate, but the move is again queen takes f4. So after the queen takes, pawn takes, we have this powerful move, knight f6. And now the queen cannot move anywhere to continue to protect f7. And this time, even if they go somewhere else, even if they go here, it is not about the fork, it is about checkmate. So knight f7 and checkmate. So this is what actually happened in the game. So after knight f6, we have knight e6. Then Lasker captured on d7, and after knight g5, guys, the rook is going to penetrate to the 7th rank, and the game is over for the black pieces. Just to show you how the game continued, the black pieces played for a few more moves. So we have king g8, knight f6, king f8, rook takes on c7. So that rook is already collecting pawns on the 7th rank. and at this point the black pieces resign. Guys, like I always tell you before we go on to the game that we have to analyze, feel free to, when you finish with the lesson, go back and set this position against the engine and see if you can finish it. Try to play it as a white pieces, see if you can finish the game all the way to the end. Okay guys, so now that you saw what you should be looking for when you have the opportunity to place your knight on the outpost, now we're going to look at it from the perspective of the person with the rook on the open or semi-open f-file. So this is the position that we had before. This is where I stopped before we talked about it from white's perspective. But let me just put everything back quickly and let me again insert the first few moves. So knight f3, knight c6, white pieces play the real opus, a6, bishop a4, knight f6 attacking the pawn, they castle, they don't really mind it. So bishop e7, rook e1, pawn to d6, c3, preparing d4, and it is very typical for the white pieces to do c3 so that the bishop could hide on c2. Many times the black pieces do b5, bishop b3, knight a5, trying to get that Spanish bishop, and then the white pieces already have c2 for the bishop to hide. So anyways, after pawn to c3, bishop g4, d4, remember that we have the knight is pinned, so knight d7, d5, knight b8, and now the moment this happened, the white pieces know what to do, the black pieces know what to do. So pawn h3, asking the bishop if it's going to stay there, capture, move away. The black pieces decided to do bishop h5, then knight b to d2. Pay attention to this knight. You're going to see how they maneuver it, how they bring it to the king's side, from the queen's side to the king's side. So anyways, after knight b to d2, we have bishop g6, then bishop c2, the black pieces castle, and after knight f1, we finally have pawn to f5, and the black pieces already make contact with the e4 pawn. Now guys, let me just make a pause here for a moment, just to tell you one thing. If you remember from lesson number 72, we talked about prophylaxis. So one thing that the white pieces could have done here is, okay, I know that my opponent, this is the pawn structure, my opponent's plan is based on this break on f5. So what if I'm prophylactic and I do something like pawn to g4? So notice that now it is going to be really difficult for the black pieces to actually do f5. So this is something to keep in mind. If you really understand these middle game ideas, you could use them to prevent your opponent from creating anything. Now in this game, I think that the white pieces were comfortable with this f5 because they counted on the knight getting to the outpost, and that's perfectly fine. So after knight f1, f5, they captured on f5, bishop takes, and now knight to g3. Look at that knight. It went from b1, d2, f1, and g3. So anyone who plays the real opus, they're experienced with it, they are familiar with all of these maneuvers, with all of these positions, guys. So after knight g3, bishop takes, and queen c2. Up to this point in the game, if we evaluate this position, we can see how the white pieces have control over the light squares in the center, especially that e4 square. The black pieces, they're left with a bad bishop. Notice how the pawns in the center are the same color as the bishop, but they also have very good squares for their pieces. They have c5, f4, and even f5. So now it is a matter of the black pieces finding ways to create weaknesses on the king's side and taking advantage of them. Guys, that's exactly what you need to look for. If you're the one with the semi-open or open f-file, you need to put pressure on it to force your opponent to create weaknesses, and you're going to see what I mean in a moment. Now, for those of you paying attention, I have a question for you. I mentioned the f4 square, so which of our pieces do you think we should put on f4? Well, easy. We want to put a knight. So the question for you now is, can you find the fastest plan to get this knight from d7 all the way to f4? Feel free to pause the video, take your time until you find the best route for that knight. We learned, I think lesson 52 as well, that we could do it by thinking backwards. So where does a knight need to be in order to get to f4? Well, g6. Where does it have to be in order to get to g6? f8. So I could do knight f8, g6, and f4. So in this game, the black pieces did rook f7, then bishop e3. Look, in the other position that I showed you from Lasker, he didn't have the bishop to put on e3, so he put the queen. In this case, he has it. So you can see how the bishop went to e3, then knight f8, pawn to c4, following through with their plan to make contact with the pawn in front of their most forward pawn, Then knight b to d7, keeping an eye out for c5 and developing that piece. Pawn to b4, the knight is not gonna go to c5, plus we're going to get ready to break on c5. Now, knight to g6, then knight e4, finally putting the knight on that outpost, and the black pieces are doing the same thing, knight f4. Now guys, at this moment, it didn't happen, but what would you do if the white pieces did something, a bad move like pawn to a3? Pause the video again and see if we can find this simple tactical idea. Well guys, all we're looking for is a move like knight takes h3, and if the pawn takes, then we collect on f3. So you see that knight already on f4 is putting a lot of pressure, and before you know it, tactics are going to be in the air. So that's the reason why the white pieces did not let the knight stay there for long. They actually took on f4. Now the rook takes, we do not want to close the file. And now for the remaining of the game, it's going to be about the white pieces trying to demonstrate that the e4 outpost is better than the f file, and the black pieces are going to try to prove that controlling the f file is more powerful than the e4 outpost. So you're going to see what happens in the game, guys. The truth is, in my opinion, that the outpost is going to be more powerful. Having a knight on e4 is more powerful than having a rook on the f file. And the reason being is that not only is the knight controlling all of these squares in black's territory, but the knight is also defending the weakest point that we have to put pressure on through the f file. So even if we put all of our major pieces on the f file, we're going to be attacking a pawn that is defending by a knight. So that's why the knight proved to be superior. Now, that doesn't mean that the side with the knight is going to win every time, as you're going to see in this game, but I think it's important for you to know, and I also want you to remember one thing. It is all about you putting pressure down that file and trying to create weaknesses like Janowski did in this game. So at this point we have knight f to d2, then knight f8, and then the white pieces just kicked the rook out. Guys, this is exactly what the black pieces are looking for. We want to force them or provoke them to move the pawns on the king side. Every time they do that, they create weaknesses. Now, the next thing that we need is for them to actually push the f pawn. When that happens, this knight is not going to be so efficient. He's not going to be defending the pawn. They're going to need other pieces to defend it. So anyways, the rook went to f7, then king g2, the knight goes to g6, knight goes to b3, finally trying to just break on c5. And now guys, what would you do here if you were the black pieces? We're not looking for any tactic, nothing crazy. Think of at least 3 candidate moves, but the logical move here is queen d7. We're improving the queen, and this rook that is doing nothing is finally coming to the king side. So rook e3, rook a to f8, queen e2, and now guys, we're looking for a better square for our knight. Our knight cannot do much from g6. What if we could put it on f5? So again, see if you can find a plan to get the knight from g6 to f5 as quickly as possible. Well, if you thought of moving the bishop first to d8, congrats, that's exactly what the black pieces did in this position. So rook d1, knight goes to e7, and finally pawn to c5. So now knight f5, getting to a better square. Ideally, we want to get to d4 safely. So knight f5, rook c3, and now guys, we have to be careful with pawn to c6. If this pawn gets to c6, let's say I did a move like, I don't know, h6. If this happens, guys, we're done. We're going to have to take, and after the rook takes on c6, a6 is going to fall sooner or later, plus they're going to put a lot of pressure on the base pawn. Once the c7 pawn falls, d6 falls, everything falls. So the black pieces here anticipated that, and they went, instead of a move like h6, they went queen a4, getting away from that move, but also putting pressure on b4. So we win a tempo on it, and now they forced the white rook to get to c4. And this is extremely important because now the queen went back to e8. Remember, if we're going to be attacking on the king side, the queen has nothing to do on the queen side. This was just temporary, and now after c6, we actually get to do b5. We do it with a tempo on the rook, and guys, we locked the queen side. So now it's going to be very comfortable after rook c3. You're going to see how we can actually focus on attacking on the king side without having to worry about the queen side. It is just us attacking here, and we don't have to worry about what happens on the other side. Now, after pawn h6, If the white pieces want to continue to be consistent and do rook a1 trying to break on a4, then we have this move. Knight d4, knight takes, pawn takes, and after the rook moves, can you guys pause the video and find the strongest move? The move is going to be rook takes on f2, attacking the queen, and then if the knight takes, of course, we collect the queen. If the queen takes, then we could take with the other rook. Even though we're giving the 2 rooks for the queen, we're going to have a superior position, guys. After we could do queen e5, and it's going to be hard for the white pieces to coordinate their pieces. So anyways, that's the reason why they did not do rook a1. Instead, rook c to d3, and now the black pieces did knight e7, just opening up the rooks again to put pressure on the f file. But I have to say, guys, here it makes a lot of sense for the black pieces to have done g5 followed by rook g7, h5, and just continue to attack on the king side. Remember, the center is locked, so it allows us to open up the king and use our pieces to attack, since our pieces don't have any lines to come in and attack. So that's just something to keep in mind. Instead, again, they went knight e7, rook 1 to d2, rook f5. Now the knight goes to a1, trying to reroute to e3. We see again another knight maneuver to improve their pieces. Then queen g6, finally getting the queen in the action. Knight goes to c2, rook f4, taking advantage of the pin and putting pressure on that knight. So finally, we provoked the white pieces to do pawn to f3. And guys, this is what I mentioned before. This knight is not so efficient anymore because it's not controlling the weakest point on the f file. So now they need other pieces to take care of that pawn. So our strategy worked. Now we go rook f7, king h1, knight goes back to f5, putting pressure on g3. Again, keeping an eye out on d4. So queen goes to g2, pawn h5. Again, just being energetic. We don't want to do anything slow. We want to continue as energetically as we can, guys. So pawn to h4, then queen h6, and the question for you is, why do you think they did queen h6? It's not to put pressure on the rook. The rook is defended by so many pieces. Instead, we're looking for ways to continue to make progress. We want to open up that king because we have more pieces ready to attack. So queen h6, rook d1, pawn to g5, pawn takes, bishop takes, now pawn to f4, and the bishop went back to f6. Now after queen h3, the black pieces did queen g6, then knight goes to e3. We're not going to trade, we're going to do knight d4, placing our knight on a very nice square, and you're going to see how that knight remained there, and thanks to it, the black pieces won the game. Now at the same time, a move like knight d4 allowed the white pieces to do f5, creating a pass pawn. Notice how that pawn before was not passed, it could have been taken. But the moment they did pawn f5, that pawn became a pass pawn. So the black pieces did queen h6, and now there is a forced continuation for the white pieces to win an exchange. So see if you can find it, white to move, and they win an exchange. The move that we're looking for here is knight g4. There's a pin on the pawn, it cannot be taken. So the queen went to h7, knight takes, rook takes, and now the question is, should the knight capture the rook? And let's take a moment to talk about this, guys. A lot of times, even if we feel that the knight is way superior to the rook, and we talked about this in another lesson where I showed you a very nice game played by Kasparov where he sacrificed his queen for 2 minor pieces, and we talked a lot about the relative value of the pieces. Now, even if we know that the knight is better than the rook, a lot of people are going to do it because they're going to be thinking, what if I don't and then I regret it? Then if I get in trouble, the rook is going to be more powerful. Well, I understand that, I've been there myself, but in this case, not only is this knight controlling a lot of good squares in black's territory, we also have this very nice tactic that since we have the pawn on c6, the black pieces always have to be concerned about this move. Knight takes d6, if the pawn takes, then the passed pawn is really close to the end. So this is going to be a concern for the black pieces at this point in the middle game. It is going to be the same thing in the end game. So it's a very powerful knight, and that's why we have to think twice before we take the rook. So in this game, they actually took on f6, so the rook took back, then rook f1, queen f7. In case you're wondering, guys, we cannot do knight f5 because then they just double up. So queen f7 instead, queen g2, rook takes, and then queen takes f5. So we get to this position where you might be thinking, okay, the white pieces are up an exchange, but in reality, this powerful knight along with the passed pawn is going to give the black pieces huge compensation. Like right now, the white pieces should not even think of doing something like rook a3 to go after the pawn, because after e4, e3, the knight is going to support the pawn all the way to e2, and this is going to be a winning position for the black pieces. So instead, rook e3 happened, taking care of that passed pawn, queen b1, king h2, they captured on b4, and now we have a 2 versus 1 on the queen side. So you're going to see how that's going to be another factor helping the black pieces win this game. So after they took pawn to g4, and another question for you, should we take the pawn or not? Well guys, we should know our opponent has queen and rooks. We don't want to open up files. Instead, h4, and we're going to use their pawn as a shield for our own king. After pawn to h4, we have king h3 going after the pawn, the queen goes to c4, then queen e4, trying to get to g6, and again, what would you do if you were the black pieces? We cannot let them put us in check. So the move here is king g7, and that king is defending itself. It doesn't need help from any other piece. Now, after king captures on h4, queen c1 trying to come over to h1, pawn a3. Guys, pawn a3 looks like a really bad move, but in reality, there's nothing better for the white pieces here. Ideally, they'll be bringing the rook into the game, but the knight is controlling this square. So the queen cannot get closer, the rook cannot get closer. There's not much more for them to do. They have no plan. If you don't have a plan, the game becomes really difficult to play. So after pawn to a3, we have pawn a5. You see, the black pieces have a clear plan. They're going to put their pawn majority in motion. So after king g3, we have check, king goes to h3, queen f2, pawn to g5, pawn to b4, pawn takes, then king goes to g4 just to bring the rook to the h file and hopefully coordinate their pieces and put the king in checkmate. Now the black pieces of course cannot let that happen, so queen g1 check, the king goes to h5, again we cannot let this happen, so queen h2 check, the king goes to g4, pawn to b3, the pawn is getting closer to the end, rook e1 trying to get to the h file again, and then to h7, but now the black pieces did queen c2. So if they take, the pawn takes, and then that passed pawn protected by the knight, plus this other passed pawn should be enough to win the game. If they give us the opportunity after the pawn takes, we're going to do something like knight b3, and then promote. So it will be something like this. Let's say they go rook c1, because if they don't, the knight comes over and c1. So if rook c1, guys, we could just bring the king up. Notice how this king cannot go anywhere here. Let's say they do something like, I don't know, king here. Well, now pawn e4. And the rook just cannot take care of both pawns and the knight. So going back here, in this game, they did not capture on c2. They just went king h5. Now queen takes, rook takes, and now a very powerful move, guys, that is not easy to find unless you have a really good understanding of endgames. But Janowski found a very nice maneuver, and that move is knight c2. Now this knight is taking this cross away from the rook, so the rook cannot go after the passed pawn. And if they did something like, I don't know, rook here, we could do pawn to b2, and then after knight a3, that's it, guys. They're gonna have to give us the rook for the pawn, and then this is a very easy endgame to win. Now in the actual game, the white pieces did rook takes e5. Very nice resource. So the question for you is, what would you do? Well, this is a good opportunity to implement what we learned in our last lesson, the take it easy rule. So we gotta take it easy. We don't want to hurry up. There's a reason why they're giving us a rook, so we're not going to take. Instead, the black pieces did b2, and there's nothing that they could do. So they went check, king f8, they took on c7, then finally the queen is on the board, then check, king e7, check, king d8 going towards the rook, king went to e8, and after rook takes d6, knight d4, and finally the white pieces resigned. It's like I told you before, you could also use this position, put it on the engine, play it against the engine, and see if you can finish it all the way until the end. Now, I only showed you the entire game because I really like to review games, guys, from opening to middle game, from middle game to end game, and I feel like you learn a lot with that. But the most important thing about this lesson is that now not only do you know what to do when you get this pawn structure, that f5 or that c5, but you also know that you're going to get this typical outpost on e4 versus the semi-open or open file, and you should know how to continue from either side. If you have the knight, you want to make sure that when the knight gets to e4, it gets there to stay. So you want to remove any pieces that could get you out, and you gotta make sure that you have the other knight ready to replace it. If you have the f file, well, first try to remove that knight from the outpost, and if you can't, well, use the f file to put pressure and to provoke weaknesses in your opponent's king side, and then you can move in and capitalize on those weaknesses. So guys, at this point, you know more middle game strategy than a lot of players. So if you get to use these ideas in any of your games, especially those of you following this course and you're playing the King's Indian Defense, the Pirks, even the Vienna with the Fianchetto, let me know. And like always, we're going to talk in the comments. So with that said, I'll see you guys in our next lesson.